For centuries, one name has carried the weight of a lie: Ham. His story was twisted into a weapon cited to divide peoples, to explain oppression, to mark entire nations as cursed. But the ancient texts tell a very different story, one that has been buried beneath layers of politics, fear, and convenient theology. Tonight, we reopen the record. We step into the world after the flood. A fragile beginning where families became nations and choices shaped the future of civilizations. Hidden in genealogies and forgotten kingdoms along the Nile and the Levant lies a thread that scholars have quietly followed for generations. A thread that unravels myths about race destiny and divine intention. This is not about controversy. It is about clarity, reading the words as they were meant to be read, and letting history speak for itself. If we listen carefully, the past lifts its veil. Ham. In Hebrew, the word carries echoes of warmth, heat, something darkened by the sun. And yet scholars warn us not to mistake poetry for biology. The ancients described lands, climates, cultures, not genetic categories, not hierarchies of skin. Already the story resists the labels we tried to force upon it. The Bible's genealogy unfolds like a map. Ham has 4 sons: Cush, Mizraim, and Canaan. From their lines, Scripture sketches a migration spreading from the eastern Mediterranean down through the Nile Basin and deep into the regions of East Africa. It is less a myth and more a memory, fragments of families becoming nations of rivers, hosting empires of coastlines, shaping destinies. Then comes the crack in the narrative, the moment history bent the text. For centuries, some insisted that Ham himself was cursed. But when we return to the passage, the illusion dissolves. The judgment falls on Canaan, not on Ham, and its purpose is theological, tied to moral choices and the drama of land and covenant, not biology, not race. One of the longest-lived lies in history was built on a misreading small enough to fit inside a single sentence. Here the story turns contemplative. How many times have powerful people rewritten, meaning to justify their ambitions? How often did entire civilizations inherit shame that never belonged to them? The deeper we read, the less this story explains about who deserves to rule, and the more it reveals about how fragile truth becomes when fear meets authority. Ham's legacy is not shadow, it is movement, resilience, innovation, memory. These are the roots of kingdoms, trade routes, languages, and prayers that traveled farther than any army ever could. And as we follow those roots outward, the map widens. Cush rises on the horizon. Egypt awakens. Libya sharpens its bows. The thread continues, because to understand Ham, we must next walk the roads of his sons and see how their worlds reshaped the story of humanity. This part opens like a map being slowly unrolled. First, Cush, the name echoing across the valleys of ancient Sudan, Nubia, and Ethiopia. Here, along the Nile's darker, deeper stretches, kings rose whose ships crossed the Red Sea and whose caravans stitched continents together. There was a time when rulers from Cush wore the pharaoh's crown, reminding the world that power did not only flow north, sometimes it returned from the south with thunder. Then we turn to Mizraim, the Hebrew word for Egypt, the land of 2 realms where desert and river were locked in delicate conversation. This was not mere myth. It was engineering, astronomy, theology woven into stone. Every temple whispered a question, not who is superior, but how do humans live under heaven's order. Put enters quietly west of the Nile. The chronicles remember archers from these lands, precise, patient, and feared. They joined alliances, shifted loyalties, and stood at the edges of empires where survival depended on skill rather than size. History rarely records their names, yet their arrows changed battles that changed kingdoms. And then Canaan, not Africa, but the Levant, crossroads of prophets, trade, and collision. Here the Bible's narrative turns moral rather than biological. The warnings tied to Canaan speak of ethics, injustice, covenant, not pigmentation, not destiny written in skin. Each son of Ham did not create a race. Each one unfolded a civilization with its own beauty, tensions, and calling. The story becomes larger than stereotypes and deeper than slogans. These are not caricatures. They are ancestors who built bridges, commercial, cultural, spiritual, long before we learned to divide them. And the further we travel, the more their footsteps converge with ours. Because the next part of the journey follows where these lines spread, mingled, and reshaped entire continents. If this telling is opening new windows for you, leave your reflection as a written prayer, not to judge, but to understand what the story of our ancestors is inviting you to see. This part unfolds like an atlas of forgotten roots. From the moment the waters of the flood receded, the descendants of Ham began tracing lines along the Nile, across the Red Sea coast, and into the Levant. In Assyrian inscriptions, Egyptian reliefs, and Greek histories, we catch glimpses of them not as shadows on the edge of the story, but as traders, warriors, envoys, and kings moving through the very heart of the ancient world. Instead of standing at the margins, Ham's line stands at the crossroads of salvation history. In one century, a Cushite ruler appears in Egyptian records as a conqueror. In another, diplomats from these lands arrive in Jerusalem with gifts and inquiries. Sometimes they are named as enemies, sometimes as allies, but always as part of the living network through which prophecy, war, and worship flowed. The Bible's narrative is surrounded and sometimes carried by people whose ancestry Scripture ties back to Ham. Then comes the modern twist. For a long time, people spoke of Africa as if it were a single block, one skin tone, one culture, one destiny. But archaeology and genetics now reveal something far more intricate: waves of migration moving in and out of the continent, Cushite, Semitic, and other groups, mingling, separating, and returning. Ancient roads did not just radiate from Mesopotamia. They pulsed back and forth across the Nile, the Sahara's edges, the Red Sea Straits. The descendants of Ham were never isolated. They helped shape the political, economic, and spiritual environment in which the Bible's story unfolded. When you look again at the old maps, you start to see their fingerprints everywhere, on city names, trade routes, and even in prophetic oracles that call distant nations back to God. But the map is only half the story.
See it straight.
To truly understand Ham's legacy, we must follow not just where his descendants went, but how their bloodlines intertwined and transformed the world that came after. After the flood generations, the descendants of Ham did not stay pinned to one patch of earth. They moved along the Nile's green ribbon, hugged the Red Sea coast, slipped down into the Horn of Africa, and with courage and wind and wooden hulls, crossed the Arabian Sea toward the shores of South Asia. In some ancient Indian traditions, echoes of dark-skinned seafarers and early Dravidian peoples appear at the edge of memory. Modern research suggests a web of older connections, African, Near Eastern, and local, layered over one another like tides that never stopped returning. Human history has never lived inside neat little boxes. It breathes, migrates, and refuses to obey the lines we draw on maps. Meanwhile, in the Mediterranean world, Cushite and Egyptian merchants sailed north with gold, ivory, incense, and scrolls. They returned not only with oils, wine, and tools, but with words, gods, and stories. Ideas traveled in the same ships as spices. A proverb heard in one harbor might be retold in another. A foreign deity might be reinterpreted in the light of a different heaven. Slowly, quietly, cultures intertwined. From a biblical theological lens, the Table of Nations no longer looks like a cold list of names, but a snapshot of a living network, people related by blood, separated by distance, yet constantly reconnecting. The borders we treat as absolute are so often only the later drawings of fearful descendants. We are walking through the geological layers of memory. If this journey touches something in your own story, let your reflection be a small act of remembrance, a way of honoring the unnamed ancestors who built bridges long before we knew their names. And as we honor them, we are finally ready to face a darker layer of the story. How a single misreading tried to turn this rich legacy into a curse takes us into the controversy's beating heart. After the flood, the text records a moment of shame, a fractured family, and a prophetic word spoken over Canaan. It is a difficult scene, restrained, symbolic, and layered with meaning about land justice and moral responsibility. But centuries later, another story was told on top of it. A simpler one, a more convenient one. People began to say Ham was cursed, therefore the peoples descended from him are destined for servitude. And with that sentence, theology was bent into a chain. When we return to the ancient narrative, the illusion breaks. The passage speaks of Canaan, not Ham, of consequences in a specific world, of city-states and contested territories, not of entire continents fated to bow. There is no racial science hidden between the lines, no divine endorsement of human cruelty. Instead, there is a sober warning about how corruption spreads through families and how justice, however mysterious, eventually confronts injustice. Many early Jewish sages and Christian theologians did not teach a doctrine of racial inferiority from this text at all. Their concerns were ethical, covenantal, spiritual. The idea that this scene could justify enslavement or segregation emerged later when politics, economics, and fear needed holy language to disguise themselves. Sometimes the most dangerous thing is not the scripture, but the human heart reading it. Here the story slows. We are left with an unsettling question. How many wounds in history were opened by interpretations that looked pious on the surface, yet were crafted to protect power? And yet the narrative of Ham does not end in darkness. Beyond the distortion lies a different legacy, one of cities, cultures, and contributions that shaped the world. To see it clearly, we must let the text breathe again, and then step forward into the story of how that legacy became a light. Throughout the Bible's timeline, the descendants of Ham move in and out of the frame, merchants riding caravans, envoys negotiating treaties, soldiers marching at the edges of empires, and sometimes kings whose choices carried moral weight. They are not portrayed as props, but as participants woven into the same tapestry of responsibility and grace that defines every nation in Scripture. Ham is not the shadow of history. He is a living branch in the garden of God. Look closer, and the contributions come into focus. Along the Nile, architecture leapt from mud brick into monuments that still defy the centuries. Irrigation systems turned desert edges into farmland. Music, art, and craftsmanship gave voice to hopes and fears shared by all humanity. Knowledge moved quietly from fields and workshops into palaces and temples, shaping how people prayed, traded, and governed. The civilizations linked to Ham were not primitive footnotes. They were laboratories of culture. What if the story of Ham is less about punishment and more about purpose? The biblical narrative suggests that every people, whatever their struggles are, summoned into God's wider design. When Israel's prophets speak of nations returning with gifts and worship, they are not describing erasure. They are imagining reconciliation. No one is born to live beneath a misinterpretation. The same passages once twisted to justify domination now reveal a warning against spiritual pride. Whenever humans twist sacred words to enslave others, the text eventually testifies against them. History exposes the lie. Truth breaks the chains, sometimes slowly but inevitably. If this journey has lifted a weight for you, write it down not as a debate, but as gratitude that damaged stories can be healed. Because the path ahead invites us even deeper, from lineage to calling, from ancestry to hope. And to understand where this hope is leading, we must now follow the promise as it moves across borders and through time into the unfolding story of faith. The story of salvation in Scripture does not skirt the lands of Ham. It moves directly through them. Prophets speak of Ethiopia stretching out its hands to God of Egypt, turning from idols to acknowledge the Lord of distant nations, bringing offerings from beyond the rivers of Cush. The Bible's future vision is not one color replacing another, but many peoples gathered into one worship without losing their names. Across centuries, these glimpses form a pattern. The same regions once portrayed as rivals or strangers become in prophetic imagination participants in restoration. The message is subtle but unmistakable. No lineage is written off. Every nation stands under judgment and mercy side by side. The gospel itself spreads along routes first carved by traders, sailors, and diplomats from these very lands. North Africa becomes one of the earliest centers of Christian theology. Egyptian deserts host communities of prayer that shape global spirituality. The children of Ham are not spectators in the drama of faith, they are actors on the main stage. All the genealogies, all the migrations, all the moments of conflict and reconciliation point to a God who redeems history not by erasing cultures, but by purifying them. The old lie that ancestry determines worth collapses in the presence of a God who calls nations not to submission under one another, but to allegiance under Him. God does not run a race of races. He writes a story of redemption across every shade of humanity. And as the curtain draws near, one question remains echoing across maps, ruins, and scriptures: if Ham's story is not a curse, but a calling, what other forgotten stories still wait to be restored? The journey is not finished, it is only opening. We have walked the long road of Ham, from a name clouded by misunderstanding, through kingdoms that shaped the ancient world, to a truth both simple and powerful. No people is created for humiliation. What history twisted into a curse becomes, under the light of Scripture, a calling woven into God's larger story. And, as the echoes fade, something remains. The records, the prophecies, the migrations, all of them whisper the same invitation: look again. Read more carefully. Listen with humility. The story is complete for now, yet the reflection it stirs continues far beyond this moment. If this journey opened a new perspective for you, I invite you to share, and subscribe, not as routine gestures, but as a way of helping others see the text without the chains history wrapped around it. Leave a comment below. What part of this story challenged you or restored something you thought was lost? Stay with us, because the path ahead leads deeper into the mystery. In our next episode, we follow Cush, the forgotten empire that once stood at the center of biblical history and surprised the world. The past is still speaking, and sometimes the voices we thought were silent were simply waiting to be heard.